Thank you, Taroshan. Thank you to my friends in Houston, and especially Jagdeep Aluwale and his colleagues for making this possible. I made two very memorable trips to Houston over the past several years and hope to return again to the great state of Texas. It says so much about your state that it has become synonymous with around the world with so many industries, from agriculture to energy to healthcare, education, and of course, space. And it might surprise you, I think one of the things that might surprise a lot of you who are in many of these industries, to know that at one point of time, the most lucrative and important commodity traded between the United States, not necessarily Texas, but the United States as a whole, and India, was in fact ice. And I think this is actually an interesting way to start my presentation. 200 years ago, a wealthy Bostonian named Frederick Tudor started harvesting and shipping ice from the rivers and ponds of New England to warmer climes. And at first he focused on places in the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean. But over time, he developed this audacious plan of shipping ice all the way from New England to Calcutta in India. And this, in fact, which was a big gamble at the time, made him millions in today's dollars. He became known as the Ice King, and he built these beautiful storage buildings known as ice houses in 3 Indian cities, in Calcutta, in Bombay, and in Madras, today, what is known today as Chennai in southern India. And in fact, if you, I know there's some people on this call who are from Chennai originally, if you go to the beach in Chennai, you can still see that ice house, which is now associated with the famous Indian spiritualist, Swami Vivekananda. But what's interesting is that this ice trade, which for a while started out very quickly, was very lucrative, it stopped almost as quickly as it started. Technological developments such as the making of ice artificially in plants, and then refrigeration in the early 20th century made this entire industry redundant. And the reason I bring this up is that the rise and sudden fall of the ice trade, to me, in some ways represents the waves of engagement, the turbulence, but also the long history and the opportunity in the India-US commercial relationship. Today, we associate the US-India commercial relationship with services, with automotive parts. I've had the pleasure of visiting the Mahindra factory outside Houston. Defense, LNG now, which is a major export to India. But 10 or 20 years from now, things will look quite different. And the changes we're witnessing just this year, whether it's coronavirus, the almost certain global recession that we'll see over the coming months to years, and of course, increased US-China competition that Houston is currently experiencing firsthand, these trends will accelerate some of these transitions that I'll get to in a second. But it makes it all the more important that we anticipate what the future of the India-US relationship looks like. So let me quickly sum up the India-US relationship. Dennis Cox, who was an American diplomat who served for many years in South Asia, wrote a book on the United States and India a few years ago, and he called it Estranged Democracies. And I was always struck by the title, Estranged Democracies. Of course, the title in some ways overlooks a lot of things that the US and India did do, whether it was cooperation during World War II. In fact, many American servicemen served in India during that time, to the cooperation against China in the 1950s and 1960s when there were shared concerns about the rise of communist China. But while there was this political estrangement, especially from about 1965 to 1995, the people-to-people relationship between India and the United States quietly blossomed. And I think there's no better testament to that than the large and vibrant Indian diaspora in Houston today. I like to make the argument that, why this happened, why there were political differences between these two large countries, and yet at the same time, this burgeoning people-to-people relationship. It was due to a certain number of qualities that I think make America exceptional. And I don't mean American exceptionalism in the way that term is often used, but actually literally, there were in fact 3 things about the United States that ensured that it remained attractive to Indians despite the political differences between their countries. The first, I think, was American democracy, the rule of law, belief in free market, free markets, and I think we take it for granted. But Indians proved to be naturally comfortable in an environment where there was that rule of law, where there was democratic politics, where there was a sort of free market culture. And you see this in terms of where Indians moved to in the 50s and 60s and 70s. It was the United States, it was the United Kingdom, it was Western Europe, it was places like, just to some degree, Canada and Australia. But it wasn't to places like the Soviet Union, which was politically much closer to India at the time. But I think, it wasn't just the sort of democratic values. That was certainly one element of it. There was also an American spirit of liberal internationalism, and particularly after World War II. And this was driven in some ways by the Cold War, this idea of global competition with the Soviet Union. But this also saw a big increase in American aid and assistance. In fact, for a few years in the 1960s, India was the single largest recipient of American foreign assistance. But also things like the creation of the Peace Corps. And I mentioned that because even now when I go to all different parts of the United States, I still meet people often of a particular generation who did spend a couple of years in India as part of the Peace Corps. Finally, I think another element was a very important element, of course, was the United States immigration policy, and particularly after the passage of the Hart-Celler Act of 1965, under the administration, of course, of a great Texan, Lyndon B. Johnson. And for the first time after 40 years, since the 1920s, you saw an increase in the United States of high-skilled immigration from many different countries, including, in particular, India. Now, of course, there were other factors that drew people to the United States. There was the American universities, the dollar, and Hollywood, all of which actually remained without serious competition. But I think again, we take some of this for granted. I think it was these underlying principles of democracy, rule of law, liberal internationalism, and a particular immigration regime that really attracted Indians to the United States, and ensured in some ways that the relationship deepened, even at a time when the geopolitics was often adverse. So after the end of the Cold War, and India, this coincided in some ways with India's economic liberalization in 1991, the natural convergences start to align with the political convergences. And we saw the relationship advanced with visits to India by Bill Clinton, by George W. Bush, 2 visits by Barack Obama, 1 in each term, and of course 1 by Donald Trump. In fact, India was one of the last places he visited before the coronavirus pandemic earlier this year. On the Indian side, leaders as diverse, and these are leaders from very different political parties, very different persuasions, Narasimha Rao, Atal Bihari Vajpayee, Manmohan Singh, and of course Narendra Modi today, all worked very hard to advance the relationship and in fact stick their neck out against conventional wisdom in India to deepen the relationship with the United States. The economic relationship, of course, was actually cemented by a crisis, and I think it's something also to keep in mind today with the coronavirus pandemic. And this crisis is one that seems sort of quaint in comparison, which was the Y2K bug in 1999 and 2000. And again, in hindsight, it doesn't seem like that big a deal, but suddenly actually a combination of a large number of English-speaking trained engineers in India, coupled with a few policy tweaks that had been in place in India in the 1980s and 1990s, and then the sudden global demand for their knowledge and expertise, it sort of kicked the India-US economic relationship into another gear, a higher gear. And again, this was despite political differences at the time over India's nuclear weapon status. So a combination of the Y2K crisis and this attempts at overcoming the question of India's nuclear weapons program actually pushed the political relationship forward. And from India's nuclear test in 1998 to 2008, when the civil nuclear agreement was concluded between India and the US. And this opened up doors to much greater cooperation, including in defense and in global affairs. Let me fast forward quickly to the Trump presidency. For the first time after Donald Trump's election in 2016, serious questions were raised about whether those pillars that made America exceptional would continue, and whether the United States would remain committed to upholding a liberal international order, whether it would remain engaged with the world, whether it would continue to attract global talent. And I think with the partial exception of that last point, which I'll get to in a second, the answer, I think, has been mostly yes. In fact, trade between India and the United States has actually increased over the last few years, even as the trade deficit something that the Trump administration has been very focused on, has actually decreased between the two countries. So in some ways, we have more balanced trade today, even as the overall pie has grown. Defense cooperation has increased too. We now have the highest level policy dialogues involving the Secretary of Defense and State with their counterparts in India. We have new military exercises, the first exercise between the Army, Air Force, and Navies at the same time between the United States and India that were conducted just a few months ago. And the Indian military now uses 7 major defense platforms sourced from the United States, with the possibility of a few more coming online soon. Shared concerns about China have actually led to much greater, much deeper cooperation between the two countries, often in the context of their separate Indo-Pacific strategies. And more immediate differences on China, whether on trade, the boundary dispute in India's case, or issues like corporate espionage, which has been in the news again in Houston, have actually pushed this relationship closer together. And we're seeing a level of cooperation today that really would have been unimaginable 15 or 20 years ago. There's certainly been a share of challenges too, some of which were not fully anticipated. One is continuing differences over how to deal with Russia, which remains a major defense partner, in particular of India, not a major trade partner. But the relationship with Russia has become politically very controversial in the United States. The tightening of immigration, I think, has also proved a challenge, whether it's tourist short-term visas, whether it's students, and the recent move by the DHS to potentially suspend certain F1 student visas. And again, this decision was reversed. But I think the uncertainty has really affected the decision by a lot of Indians to want to come to the United States to study. Non-immigrant workers as well, H-1Bs and J-1 visas, and of course the naturalization process. And all of these, I think, questions have been thrown up about them, which have affected the bilateral relationship. I should add, though, however, that this is not just an issue in India-US relations. This is really part of a domestic debate in the United States about immigration policy writ large. And finally, I'll end with, where is the relationship going? While we may see a partial trade agreement soon between India and the US, India's Commerce Minister hinted at this just a few days ago, we are in the midst, in some ways, of a collective crisis. The onset of the coronavirus pandemic, coupled with the economic consequences of that, and to top it off, increased geopolitical competition with China. The combination of this is really, I think, both a challenge for both of our countries, but I would also look at it as an opportunity, although one with caution, which is why in some ways I began with the story of the ICE trade. While the services sector, the defense industry, and the energy sector may provide the sinews of the India-US commercial relationship today, the coronavirus pandemic and the push for renationalization of supply chains in various industries will actually undercut a lot of our traditional assumptions about where the relationship is heading. In fact, the chief generators of value as major economies come out of the recession will not be I think, measured in conventional terms. It will not be in sort of traditional goods trade and other such indicators. The chief generators of values will really be in a number of new sectors. It'll come in the form of automation, in terms of targeted digital services, in health services as well, and new forms of energy generation and storage. In this sense, international cooperation, including between India and the United States, will require certain other attributes. It will require programming skills. It will require the cleaning and anonymization of large amounts of data, but it would also require respect for the rule of law and for the security of individuals. And when you think that through to its logical conclusion, it makes it all the more clear that the India-US relationship will be as important, if not more so, for the two countries going forward than it has been over the past few decades. So I'll end on that note, and I look forward to your questions, and I'd be happy to take questions on these and any number of other things in the future. Thank you.